even compared to our extant primate cousins, who actually take the perspectives, feelings, emotions of the partner into play, okay, and have that compassion and that connection and empathy. We're also the only species to have all these things: prolonged foreplay and kissing, face-to-face coitus. Pretty much the only animal, even compared to other extant primates, that actually engage pretty typically in face-to-face coitus. Multiple positions, intense female orgasms, ability to communicate during coitus, and care for the partner and their pleasure. So these are all the things that set human beings apart from the rest. We also talked about, we have menstrual cycles, we don't have an estrus cycle, right? So we don't have an estrus cycle like many other animals do. We don't have that display or change in behavior that happens around the time of ovulation. So what do we call that in human beings when there's concealed ovulation, right? So we have a menstrual cycle, not an estrus or a change in behavioral cycle. So what sets our sexual behavior and sexuality apart from the animal kingdom? So, and I say that some of these are general, just in general. Sex is in general not just quick and dirty, and sex play like in other primates. There are primates that will just kind of quickly have sex, quick and dirty, very promiscuous with a whole bunch of other individuals within their troop or within their group, okay? In general, that's not what humans do. It evolved literally into intercourse and lovemaking, where one's desires have to be balanced with the needs and desires and well-being of one's partner, because that's another part that became very unique. Can help form and maintain bonds, and part of human intimacy. So this is sort of the core of sexual behavior in human beings. And it's a core part of romantic love. It's a big aspect of that romantic love and building that partnership with somebody else. Is not always, but it's usually a big part of that. Okay, and really that's how I opened with, it's part of the human experience. So sexual behavior, sexuality, all of this is sort of part of the overall human experience. I have some cheesy little gifts and figures and pictures all throughout here, kind of cheesy, I know. Sex and love is at the core of human evolution and who we are as a species. So really, we'll talk more in the next set of lecture series that I've put up. We're going to get to after our next exam. We'll talk more about the biology and evolution of sex and love and how those two things sort of went hand in hand together. So we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so now we're going to go into some topics I think that a lot of you are well versed in, and maybe even more than I was at this time in my life. So I'm dealing with the perfect audience for this. And I know here, especially in our community, liberal arts, we still have ways to go in a lot of these different areas, but we've got a bigger knowledge base and more information and I think inclusivity than a lot of other communities in different places. So we're going to talk about gender identity, sex roles, and sexuality. All right, so brain-sex differences in human sexual behavior. Remember, this is review, okay? There are differences between the sexes in sexually dimorphic species like us. What does it mean to be sexually dimorphic? Dimorphism. There's two sexes, and those two sexes, not just there's two sexes, because some animals, the two sexes look exactly the same. Like I can't really tell, like the male clownfish from the female clownfish. Actually, marine biologists could tell that apart. That's a bad example. But animals that look exactly the same. There's no size difference. There's no teeth difference. There's no obvious difference other than a little bit of genital difference, right? There are the two sexes, I will say, look different, right? Morphism, morph, is like anatomy. Morphology, di means tooth, right? So they look different. Size, shape, structures, parts of the brain, parts of the body, parts of the anatomy, not just the reproductive structures, right? We went over this, but also other aspects of the brain and the body. So the basic genetic sort of molecular switches from early on, XY versus XX. So chromosomally, genetically, males and females are already different, right? So there are genetics, alleles that are different between the X and the Y chromosome. So we got XY versus XX. And then we have TDF versus no TDF. What's TDF stand for?
Testosterone.
Testis determining, that's good. Testis determining factor. That determines whether a testis is going to develop. Testes for tooth, right? Or no TDF. So whether you're going to get testes or ovaries. And then whether there's testosterone made or no testosterone made. If you have testes, the Leydig cells will start pumping out testosterone and masculinizing the developing male embryo and fetus, right? So male versus female development. Or in between, intersex, somewhere in between, where the chromosomal sex or genetic sex doesn't necessarily match the phenotypic sex or the sex that's on the outside, that's obvious, the part that we could see, right? Maleness and femaleness. So these overall sort of categories of structure when we look at sexual dimorphism. Sexual differentiation, we talked all about that, developing the internal and external reproductive parts and the brain. Anatomical and physiological sex differences, there are many, right? There are many. And there's brain sex differences that affect behavior. We talked about many of those. Some other parts that I'll sort of emphasize again in this aspect, communication differences between the sexes, and this is brain-based or biological, most of these. So even with looking at how the brain processes, remember, looking at male and female brains when they're trying to figure out words or if they rhyme or making sense of different words, they're different in men and women. So speaking and processing language, there's some communication differences. There's visual spatial differences from men and women, even looking very young at little boys and little girls. Okay, so things about the processing, cognition, visual spatial is different. Fine and gross motor differences as well. Remember we talked about doing all the little pegs and the thing versus projectile throwing, all of that. There's some of those, in general, there's differences. It's not to say that every man is like this and every woman is like this, or there's in between. There's variability, there's a lot of variability. So these are in general, or the average. I will say something funny about the communication thing. And this resonates, I think, with a lot of men and a lot of women. Women on average speak, depending on the study, about 6,000 to 8,000 words a day. The average man speaks about 2,000. Okay, so that's about 4 times. Females speak about 4. Everybody I tell this is like, yep, that's yep. I know every partner that I've ever had since I was younger, like in high school, they used to say, oh my God, you talk so much. My girlfriends didn't mind, they loved it. They were like, woo, we're just gabbing and talking, but it's there's like a gender difference, I think, that's there, and it comes out even in communication, okay, in the way you communicate and the way you process communication. So some of those are not just gender stereotype, but they're based on biological brain differences, okay? So we talked about the organizational and activational effects of sex steroids. Can someone, in a nutshell, just tell me what's an organizational effect of a sex steroid? When would that be acting to set up these differences? Even as small as these differences are. What is an organizational versus an activational effect? I don't know how I got green. I like that. I'm going to stick to green. Were you going to say something? Go ahead.
I think just like organizational starts like in fetal development, right? Then activational is at puberty.
That's right. That's it. Organizational, organizing the brain and the structures of the brain and body happening in fetal development in utero. Activating those set up effects or structures, activational effects come in puberty and adolescence or adulthood. Later on, when that individual is exposed to big surges of those hormones again. Because throughout childhood, remember, a lot of the sex steroids are very low. They're at low levels. So they're up in fetal development, they go down, and then they come up in puberty. Okay, so we have masculinized features, feminized features, or a combination. Yeah? Okay. Affects not only the anatomy and physiology of the brain, but behaviors, cognitive functions, some communication, processing, speaking, all of that stuff. So if we look at some of these structures of the brain, some of these deeper structures, the cerebral cortex and the cerebrum is the whole brain here. This is higher cognitive function, memory, working memory, critical thinking, personality, sense of humor, empathy. A lot of that is out in the cerebrum. But if we go deeper and we've got the olfactory bulbs and the olfactory tracts, we've got the amygdala here in blue, we've got the hippocampus in purple, and the thalamus that's kind of right in the middle. And also the fornix, which is tracts that connects a lot of this together. So this spiraling sort of setup deep below the cerebral cortex, this is part of the emotional brain known as the limbic system. And I know all of you have probably heard about the limbic system, right? A lot of people refer to the limbic system. So areas of the brain that influence sexual behavior are part of the limbic system, okay? So part of that limbic system, amygdala, Hippocampus, by the way, is a lot of your memory storage, recalling memories, hippocampal function. Amygdala is sort of processing emotions, sort of processing and dealing with and making sense of emotions. So those areas actually influence sexual behavior, part of the emotional aspect of your brain. Okay, so the thalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, which you've already learned about. Hypothalamus is, which you can't see at goodness cut, but it's right up behind there. Okay? And then the olfactory system. Okay? What is the significance of the olfactory system being a part of the limbic system?
Your smell is related to taste and your memory, it's all.
Right, right. Your smell is connected to your memories, oftentimes, right? We don't have that good of sniffers compared to the rest of the animal kingdom. Like dogs and cats are like 100, 1,000 times better when it comes to olfaction and being able to pick up odorant molecules in the air. But we still have, there is still a strong sense of smell being one of our special senses that wires into the emotional aspects of our brain. So like Jada said, the smell is actually linked to memories. And you know this. For me, I have distinct memories that go along with distinct smells. And smells that I do not like and smells I like. And they will bring up or evoke those feelings or those memories or those like emotions. Okay, so that is part of the limbic system. Also parts of the cerebral cortex are also part of the limbic system in operating this emotional memory part of the brain. And there's some gender differences in these particular areas of the limbic system. There are a little bit of size differences in different parts of the amygdala and the hippocampus. So in the memory part of the brain and in the emotional processing part of the brain. There are some slight differences anatomically in the male and female brain. All right, so we'll talk about some of the definitions before we get into all this so that we make sure we're all on the same page. Because I know even for me and just talking to other people, people will often mix up gender, right, and sex. And I know a lot of people use those interchangeably. And when you're talking about a whole demographic or a whole group, it is okay to say gender instead of sex. That is sort of that's what a lot of people refer to it as. They say, what's your gender? Really, I always want to correct them and go, you mean to say what's your sex, right? Like, so there's a difference there. Gender, there's sex roles, there's sexuality. Those are all different, right? They're all different, yes? Okay, so we're going to go through those sort of systematically. Gender or gender identity, that's the awareness or belief about one's femaleness or maleness. Are you male or female? And this occurs relatively young, at about 1.5 years old. Somewhere around that time frame. Toddler, walking around, playing with toys, asking a bunch of questions, saying no to everything. Right around that time. You guys haven't been parents yet, but that's what's happening. Okay, there's a lot of questioning and kind of figuring out, how do I fit into all this around me? Yes? All right, so it's about 1.5 years old. Gender role or sex role, that's the public manifestation or the physical manifestation of one's gender identity, that femininity or masculinity. So it includes appearance, dress, behavior, sexual orientation can be a part of that. But really it's sort of the product of biological nature, how we perceive that nature, and how we present ourselves to the world around us, right? So it's sort of the gender role, the physical manifestation of the gender identity. Now, we could add to that. Yeah.
Another
Yeah.
gender expression.
Yes. Right. Exactly. Gender expression. Exactly. Yes. Okay. Sex role impacted, so gender role impacted by culture, social interactions, upbringing, and biology. This is actually a cute little picture of my little ones and my nieces and nephews. Lola, who's now 14 with a broken ankle, walking around with a boot. We're calling her bootlegger. And then my little son, Pee-wee, who's now ginormous, he's 10. But when they were little, we were in Arizona playing around, and we put mud, they put mud all over their faces, like the Adobe red-colored mud. We're running around with sticks. I was calling them like Lord of the Flies children. They were like throwing spears and just like wild little maniacs. It was a lot of fun. So, note, sexual orientation, sexuality is different than gender identity. Just those two things are totally different. Okay. So sexual orientation and sexuality. Sexual orientation is the pattern of romantic or sexual attraction to persons of the opposite sex, the same sex, or both. So sexual orientation or overall sexuality, what you are attracted to. Circles of sexuality, this is just one. There's many different renditions of this sort of, but related is power and agency, sexual orientation and gender identity, how that fits in, sexual and reproductive health, behaviors and practices, sensuality, intimacy, all those sort of interconnected circles of sexual orientation or sexuality. Sexuality is just the capacity for erotic experiences and responses, the sexual habits and desires of a person. So the overall sort of desires, habits, behaviors of an individual, however that may manifest. Sexuality is experienced and expressed in a wide variety of ways. So we can express it as, it can be manifested as biological, physical, emotional, social, or spiritual aspects. There's lots of different components to sexuality and this expression. I will say the biological and physical components, so the actual way that sexuality and human sexual behavior is shown, is something we physiologists will refer to as the human sexual response cycle. It's a series of physiological stages that occur during sex or intercourse, coitus, and we're going to go over that entire process. And then also the basic sex drive. We're going to talk about that as well, libido or sex drive that exists in all sexually reproducing species. Not meaning that everybody has a libido or a sexual drive in an entire species, but in general, members of that species do have it, otherwise the species would become extinct. Yes? There has to be a need or an impetus, a desire to engage in sexual reproduction, otherwise the species is actually not going to survive, it's not going to thrive. Okay, so we'll talk about that in the next set of lecture slides. Those are up on Moodle already. Sexual activity, a little more on this. Sexual activity is a vital principle of the human experience. It connects the desires, pleasures, and energy of the body with human intimacy. So it can result in a lot of different things. So it's not just one avenue. It always leads to love and marriage and children or family or whatever. That's not always the path. It's involved in erotic love, intimate friendship, human mating, and procreation. That sounds weird, but us biologists, we like to keep it pretty scientific. Also, you guys have to realize I'm not coming at this from a psychology perspective, right? Some of this is intertwining science, biology, and psychology, and all of these other elements. That is not really my area. So some of you are actually better at psychology than I am, probably, okay? So what I approach all of this with is really a scientific biological lens, and I try to make sure that I encapsulate social, ethical, all of these other evidence-based parts to it when I talk about it and describe it. So please add comments, add questions, interject whenever you want, because I am really coming at it from a biological sort of lens. So I really go into sort of the science of sexuality, right? More than just the social, societal parts to it, but like the programming that's there. Okay? And also sometimes sex and sexual activity is just for pleasure, obviously, right? So these are things about the human experience that are very, very unique. Typically this begins after puberty. In the ideal, normal situation, it's after puberty. That means after sexual maturation of the individual. So nature versus nurture debate, that's always sort of based on sexuality. That's always something that has come up, and I'm sure you guys are well aware of that. Yes? Nature, meaning what?
Like what you just naturally do.
What you naturally do based on your biology, based on your genes, based on your chromosomes, based on your genetic wiring, right? That you are born that way. Versus nurture, what's that? How you're raised, your environment, learned behaviors, what else? Societal expectations, cultural expectations, right? How you are affected by your family, by other structures surrounding you in your life as you grow up. So how you were raised, what you were exposed to, what you had to deal with, all those things are the nurture component. I would like to say, and I agree with this, a lot of these modern theories, the modern theory, really sexuality is a continuous interaction of biological and social influences from conception on. Okay? And actually, I tend to be, you can guess where I tend to be a little bit more on this spectrum. Over here, over here. I tend to be over here, and I'm going to show you a lot of data, the reason I feel that way, and I will, this is just my own sort of view based on the data and the research and everything I've sort of dug up in these fields over the years. There's a lot to show that, yes, nurture obviously affects. We can't take the person out of the environment and actually study this, because we're all shaped based on how we grew up. But there's a lot of studies now, and a lot of people will disregard these and say, oh, no, it's choice, you could choose. Everything is affected by your surroundings. There's a lot of research that actually shows a lot of things, there's a lot of nature involved in sexuality. Okay, so that And I'm going to show you evidence both for and against it, but mostly for it. Okay? So it's not to say that nurture is not important, but there's a lot of biological genetic factors that we're going to sort of look at. So this continuous interaction is really important. So I would say it's not this versus this, or this or this. It's actually this and this. Yes? So for the most part, it's nature and nurture. I'm going to go back to my dark. Okay? Does that make sense? We cannot really separate the two. And even there's genes, if you have certain genes or certain mutations in your cells, in your body, and if you're exposed to certain environmental insults or factors, you will express a specific disease or have a certain cancer. So it's an interplay of genes in the environment that's always happening. We can't take those two things apart. Does that make sense? I can have mutations that will predispose me to certain cancers, but if I'm not exposed to those cancer-causing carcinogenic factors, I may not get it. So there's always an interplay. Yeah, Allie?
How does your personality develop? Where is your personality influenced by?
I would say it's a combination. I would say it's the same too again. It's this modern theory of it's nature and nurture. There are parts to your personality in your brain that are probably there very, very early. And as a mother of 3 kids and watching 3 newborn babies grow up and show the different aspects of their personalities, even though I was parenting as sort of unbiased as I could, I was not one of those moms that, like with the boys, like, oh, get up when they hurt themselves. You're fine, you're a boy, just keep, if my boy wanted to play with a doll, he could play with a doll. My daughter wanted to throw, and I would tell them both the same thing, get up, get up, you're okay, you're fine. So I wasn't a really gender discerning in my parenting. And their personalities were so vastly different, I can't even tell you, like night and day. So there are absolute elements of the brain and personality, which is the cerebral cortex, the forebrain, the prefrontal cortex, a lot of those areas, and the limbic system, there's variation right from the beginning. That's not to say what happens in your life does not influence that, right? It's how you're raised, it's socialization, it's your culture, it's your geography of where you're at, all those things come into play. So it's almost always biological and social influences. We can't take those apart, right? The interesting thing is when you see twin studies, because twin studies allow you to take those things apart, especially twins that have been separated. Biologically, genetically, they are identical. But one was raised over here and one was raised over there. So we're going to look at some of those examples of twin studies because they shed a lot of light on what is genetic, what is biological, what is learned, what is social. Okay, so sexual orientation and sexuality, lots of different combinations. Okay, you guys know all these. Heterosexual attraction to the opposite sex. Homosexual attraction to same sex. Bisexual attraction to both sexes. Alfred Kinsey, this sexual biologist, reproductive biologist, a while ago, many years ago, did a lot of major early work on human sexuality. This is just one individual. There are Johnson & Johnson or Masters & Johnson. There are all these different people that started looking at sexuality and biological basis for sexuality and looking at some of these numbers and taking in these different factors. And then he sort of came up with a theory of sexuality continuum. So this is what started challenging, okay, it's not just heterosexual and then anything non-heterosexual is abnormal. But there's actually a continuum. And I will say, so now we can say LGBTQ+, right? This in general is lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, other individuals, right? These over the last, 10 years, 20 years even, there's more sort of awareness and research and statistics and data and information on individuals that would qualify themselves into this sort of bracket, into this sort of category. And if we talk about this, because we're talking about sexuality now, right? Sexuality, sexual orientation, all of that, as well as gender identity. We're going to talk more about that one in a little bit. Do you know what the rates of LGBTQ, I can never say it fast, is in college communities, college campuses? Yes.
Isn't it statistically 1 in 4, but those statistics aren't accurate because not everybody is out?
Okay, so yeah. So the social component of being out and openly expressing those things is not always there. So these numbers are all going to be too low. I'm going to say almost every number that can come across is going to be too low, right? But it's estimated in college communities, college campuses, 10%. That means 1 out of 10. But that is not incorporating exactly what you said, Alex. So the people that are openly out about it. Another thing is if that college campus is not collecting data on this, or They have it as a question, but it's not collated and analyzed, and we don't have the stats on it. I don't really know those numbers for St. Mary's. I don't really know those numbers, and I actually would like to try to get those numbers. So, and I think you guys, when you answer at questions on ethnicity and race and gender. I don't know if you answer questions on sexual orientation or preference. Do you? At any point?
They asked us if you identify as something else, but do you have like a different gender than
Yours, yeah.
Then
Then when you're born.
they would put on there, and then they ask you they tell you can choose where you want to live, but then that's it. There's
Okay. Maybe that's why it's hard for me to get that data. I don't know, but I feel like we should have that data. Would you guys be offended if there was a question on there, what's your preferred sexual orientation? Or would you not, because you could not answer it. It would be this, or LGBTQ, or NA, don't want to answer. Someone tell me.
I feel like it'd be a smart idea to have that, like a question like that after everyone's admitted into the college, because I know
Good
some
point.
college applications
Good point.
have questions like that for schools.
Good
and
point.
If your parents look over your shoulder, you're probably not.
Good
might
point.
not want to
If
say
you
it.
feel like there's any sort of conflict of interest, or like, ooh, this might jeopardize me in some way, you're absolutely right. We're going to add to that. Tatiana?
Kind of like, you asked if we'd be offended. I'd be offended if they put preferred in there because it's not a preference. In my
Right.
opinion.
So,
Like, it's
so
a-
just
not a
sexual
choice.
orientation
Yeah.
or sexual orientation.
Because if you put preferred
Right.
in there, then it'd be like, oh, but the college might not actually be
Right. The
accepting.
wording is important.
Yeah.
You're right. The word is important. Yeah, Julia.
I noticed 2 years in a row when you do your RA survey for living in a residence hall,
Mhm.
they put it on there. Where does that?
Okay.
I can-
That might be where I could tap into that data. You want to add to that,
Yeah,
Christina?
so I'm
To the
a
RA
resident
survey.
advisor. That data goes to I believe a third-party company that brings out statistics, and that is about residence hall communities.
Okay.
So it has really, it kind of has to do with the school, but it's more so about what's happening in your residence hall.
But I might
community.
still be able to get access and talk to that third party, because that at least, all first-year freshmen are required to live on campus.
Yeah.
So that gets in that pretty much almost the entire demographic of entering freshmen. Although those things might change, people might come out, or they might change, but at least there'd be a number. Yeah, because I was digging around for this, I'm like, well, I can't even find that. I can't. So this is how, I don't want to get hung up too much on St. Mary's and stats or lack of them or transparency or whatever, because it's a data issue. 10% in general is what is reported. Most of the studies sort of cite that. Do you know about LGBTQ in the overall U.S. population? What's the percentage? Overall U.S. population, like looking at everybody, not college communities, but the overall U.S. I feel like this is quite low, actually. But there's a giant study of almost 350,000 individuals, and it was about 4.5%. Again, I feel like that's very low. And I'll show you why. I have some other numbers that will sort of contradict this. So depending on the study or the census or what program actually did it, there's going to be some differences. So the theory of sexuality continuum sort of goes into sexuality or sexual orientation being sort of a continuum and not necessarily binary for everybody. So if we look at the sexuality continuum, the Kinsey adult heterosexual homosexual continuum sort of has these numbers of 0 being exclusively heterosexual all the way to 6 being exclusively homosexual. This is based on behavioral habits throughout a lifetime. So where someone would sort of rank on this continuum. So we have 0 being completely heterosexual, so in this case, or this case, and then 6 being on the continuum for completely homosexual. Okay, so from 0 to 6. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay.
Wait, that's real?
Yes?
Wow. I was like, some people don't fall on the continuum.
At all. That's true. Some people do not fall on the continuum at all. And actually there are some people that would sort of categorize themselves as asexual, right? So like not at all, not attracted or having a pattern of either type or whatever type of sex. So asexual is another component, right, to that. So this is looking at people that actually have expressed sexuality. They're actually engaging in sex and sexuality that can be measured to be on that sort of sexuality continuum. So the rates, here's some other rates of homo, hetero, and bisexual behavior in the U.S. So exclusively homosexual, so only homosexual, about 2% of males and about 1% of females. Exclusively heterosexual, 63% of males, 87% of females. Bisexual reported about 35% of males, about 12% of females. And note, this is based on that Kinsey scale though too, of ranking sort of from 0 to 6 on that scale for someone that has an expressed sexuality. Recent surveys looking at this are pretty similar. So there's different surveys that sort of are analyzing it and not using the Kinsey scale, but comparing and looking at these rates. The numbers are pretty similar. So throughout time, from decades ago to sort of more current research. Was there a question on that? No? No? Okay. And some of these numbers, again, some of these numbers, depending on the study and the source and where they're actually getting their subjects from or the census poll numbers from, then it's going to affect the actual numbers. So I don't know if there's going to be some variability, and some of these numbers are not going to line up from study to study, and there's going to be variance. And like Alex said, this is based on people that are open and expressing and honest and where they're at and being, saying where they are. If people are not out or expressing that, then I think a lot of the numbers are actually going to be lower than what they really are. So then this goes into, on that, talking about gender identity, transgender identity. So this is trans, typically called as trans. And actually I went to San Francisco Punchline the other night, and I got to see an award-winning, she's the top transgender comedian in all of San Francisco. She was hilarious. It was really funny. She had a lot of great jokes, but she talked about it, and she was very open about it and had some really fantastic things to say. Gender identity is different than biological sex, okay? So the identity is different than biological or chromosomal sex. In many of these individuals, what is reported, and there's a couple little short documentaries of real individuals, and I'm going to share those with you later, that talk about being trans and sort of going through this process. Many define sort of one of the key feelings of being trapped in the wrong body, even from a very early age. So sort of that feeling of what's on the outside doesn't really match what they feel on the inside. So their gender identity already from a very early age. And a lot of times these were called sort of like gender non-conforming kids, or gender non-conforming is that they don't want to wear and do the gender considered behaviors and clothing and stuff that others would do at an early age. And likely there's brain differences early in life. So while I will say many of these individuals don't have adult hormonal levels that are very off and different than what would be considered male or female, respectively. So in the adult, there's not a lot of obvious hormonal differences, but there's likely some brain differences that are already there very early on, organizational effects in the fetus. So typically these individuals have normal gonads, adult levels of hormones, and they have normal secondary sex characteristics. Not always, but usually, right? So this is in general. So it's not related to sexual orientation either. This is misconception. There's misconceptions that if someone is a trans individual or identifies as transgender, that's related to their sexual orientation. It's not. Those are just like when we talk about